Hello, you're listening to The Sower, a podcast of the Ciceronian Society. This episode is an audio recording of a panel from our March 2026 conference in Omaha. It is titled The Declaration and Derailment. The first speaker is John Grove of Liberty Fund. His paper brings Michael Oakeshott's critique of political rationalism to bear on our thinking about the Declaration of Independence. The second speaker is Adam Tate of Clayton State University. His historical paper addresses the role of nationalism and the 18th century state system in interpretations of the relation between the Declaration of Independence and the earlier Articles of Confederation. Here's the panel. Enjoy.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. My name is John Grove. I'm the chair of this panel. Somebody please remind me at the end to pray us into lunch. I was told to pray at the end of the panel into lunch. So, this panel is called The Declaration and Derailment. This is an allusion, if you were in Bill McClay's talk yesterday. It is an allusion to Wilmore Kendall and George Carey's book, Basic Symbols of the American Political Tradition. And the far and away most controversial aspect of that book was the argument that the Lincolnian reading of the Declaration of Independence constituted a derailment of the American political tradition, which they argued was, prior to that, had been centered on localized Republican self-government, understood in a sort of covenantal sense under God. This book is not about, this panel is not about Kendall and Carey's book, but it is essentially a contrarian panel for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of papers that have some critique of the standard understanding of how the Declaration operates in the American political tradition. So I was going to make a joke from Arrested Development about how there are dozens of us, but it turns out there are just two of us. Unfortunately, Nathan Coleman and Jesse Merriam couldn't make it for different reasons. So it is just down to us. So you get to hear an awful lot from both of us. So John Grove and then Adam Tate is our other panelist. So I will begin. All right. My paper is called The Declaration and Rationalism, and it is going to discuss Michael Oakeshott's understanding of political rationalism and his comments on the Declaration of Independence. And the upshot of my paper, what I'm trying to get at is how a conservative who is generally convinced of Oakeshott's critique of rationalism, how that conservative should understand and approach the Declaration of Independence on the 250th anniversary. So on that 250th anniversary of the Declaration, its meaning and place in American life is contested. And as with almost every other issue of contention, the terms of the debate are often obscured by the partisan and polarized environment. Today, that discussion is framed as one between competing forms of nationalism, creedal nationalism on the one hand that identifies the lofty principles of the Declaration of Independence, specifically its second paragraph, as the core identifying commitments of the American nation, which define the citizen and establish a national purpose. And then populist nationalism, more recently, has purported to eschew these ideas, right, arguing against the notion that America is an idea, in favor of some substantive aspect of American culture as the basis of American nationhood. So sometimes this will come across as Protestant Christianity as the core. Sometimes you will get racial arguments as the core. You will get some of them more benign and some of them less benign. But the argument there is that the distinction they're drawing is between ideas on the one hand or sort of substantive culture. And this semi-sesquicentennial, I got that right, on the first try, the semi-sesquicentennial, shouldn't have tried it again. This year is an opportunity to assess the terms of these debates. And I think by going back to Oakeshott is helpful. Historically, conservatives who have critiqued creedal nationalism or sort of propositional nationhood, as we sometimes call it, have resembled, consciously or not, Michael Oakeshott's critique of political rationalism. the concept of defining a country, its constitutional order, its national mission, all according to a paragraph of theoretical claims, would seem to fit Oakeshot's conception of rationalism to a T. The political rationalist was one who sees the activity of politics as a series of problems that are solved by the application of reason, often formulated and written down as essential or fundamental propositions. And the activity of politics in this view then is to kind of put into practice the principles that themselves stand above and outside of practice. And Oakeshott accordingly did identify the Declaration of Independence as one of his prime examples. He said, along with some other not so flattering comments, he said, the Declaration of Independence has become one of the sacred documents of the politics of rationalism. Now, among the American conservatives who have aligned to some degree with Oakeshott's account are Wilmore Kendall and George Carey in Basic Symbols, when they argued that the Lincolnian reading of the Declaration constituted a derailment of the American political tradition by overemphasizing equality and natural rights over deliberative constitutional Republican government. Carey explicitly made the parallel to Oakeshott's thinking by referencing Oakeshott's categories of nomocratic and telecratic government in the preface to the 1995 edition of Basic Symbols. Mel Bradford also directly cited Oakeshott's categories in his writing on the founding period, and others like Robert Bork echoed very similar concerns, even if they did not connect the ideas directly to Oakeshott. So returning to his assessment of rationalism, I think helps us understand the limits of creedal nationalism and to clarify the alternatives. So for Oakeshott, rationalism refers to the elevation of technical knowledge over experiential knowledge. Rationalism in politics is a certain way of understanding political activity in this way, as a technique by which one orders society in order to attain a certain endpoint that has been determined in advance. And it thus relies on certain basic propositions that guide the enterprise. And political activity then is conceived as this process by which the propositions are applied or put into practice. He contrasted this with the sort of knowledge that comes from experience in an activity. In politics, he says this knowledge is drawn from immersion within a tradition of thought and action. That tradition, moreover, can't be boiled down into any digestible pieces. It is, taken as a whole, ineffable. From within a tradition, one cannot wield a tradition like a set of principles, but rather one can only, in Oakeshott's words, pursue its intimations, exploring the hints and suggestions that its patterns may evince, accommodating different ideas to one another, examining tensions and adjusting practices accordingly while maintaining a kind of flow of continuity. The core of Oakeshott's critique of rationalism hinges on the fact that the rationalist misunderstands what he's doing. He believes that he is cutting through the realm of practice and accessing a realm of principle which can serve as his guide, but in reality is taking one aspect or another of his political tradition, wrenching it from its roots that gave it life and sustained it, and presenting it instead as a principle of reason that stands utterly on its own. Rationalist explanations of politics are thus oversimplifications of reality. Rationalism, he argues, distracts from the fullness of a political tradition, which is something that can only be experienced and which can only be described in little bits and pieces at a time. Thus, the rationalist approach cuts us off from the true font of political wisdom by trying to use a phrase of Roger Scruton's. It tries to F the ineffable. He says it dries up the mind by preventing us from recognizing the genuine lessons of experience and thus from attaining what Oakeshott calls a true political education. Several consequences then follow from the rationalist approach. First, it often encourages an outright attack on practices and traditions for perceived failures to conform to the standard. That attack will then eventually become self-defeating. The rationalist does not realize that the principles he holds up depend on their cultural, religious, or social surroundings for their authority. So as he diligently works to change those surroundings, he unconsciously robs his own tools of their ability to guide and to persuade others. Moral ideals, Oakeshott says, are a sediment. They have significance as long as they are suspended in a religious or social tradition, so long as they belong to a religious or social life. The predicament of our time is that the rationalists have been at work for so long on their project of drawing off all the liquid in which our moral ideals were suspended and pouring it away as useless, that we are now left only with the dry and gritty residue which chokes us as we try to take it down. As Elizabeth Corey has described this, the rationalist approach leaves us at best with a catechism that is abstract and formulaic and often of little help in practice. And worse, it can leave us with empty phrases and ideas that can be used as weapons, making practice politically polarized and confusing. A further consequence of the rationalist approach to politics is that it promises a degree of simplicity and certainty that is never actually possible. It suggests that we can cut through the tangle and variety of experience and reorient a common life around common propositions. This can often take on a religious quality, where politics rather than providence is the orderer and director of history. When that expectation runs into reality, which is complex and contingent, it creates a political environment defined by frustrated moral ambition, in which politics can only take the form of implacable righteous causes clashing against one another. If they appeal to some symbol of a shared political tradition, it is generally one that has been hollowed out and refashioned so that its wielder can make it mean whatever his immediate needs require. The politics of rationalism is thus frenetic and disjointed. The danger that Oakeshott identifies is not so much that any particular rationalist vision will prevail. Some of them will appear to succeed, while the failure of others will be more obvious. The more pressing concern is that this style of rationalist politics will disrupt the continuity of political tradition, leaving people unable to respond to pressing questions with the full resources of their tradition. But rather, they grasp around for ready-made answers, only to find that they are empty of content and thus unable to serve the purpose. In other words, it prevents people from speaking the same language, the way he phrases that. This is, I think, a vital distinction to make, that the critique of rationalism is not about the merits or demerits of any particular rationalist political program. It is that if you appeal, or in other words, the critique is not that if you appeal to abstractions, you will always come up with bad things. The various aims of rationalists can turn out to be salutary or disastrous, taken on their own. Oakeshott says, not only are our political vices rationalistic, but our political virtues are rationalistic. The more the pervasive evil of rationalism, as he sees it, is how it distorts people's ability to discern their own experience and to essentially to know what we are doing in politics. We think that we are doing something different than what we really are. So moving to the Declaration and rationalism, in assessing the rationalism of the Declaration of Independence, one has to distinguish between the document's own claims and what has been superadded to it in later years. The rationalism implicit in the Declaration's text can be boiled down to three main elements. First, its assertion that pre-political principles, which purport to have their origin and existence outside of and prior to political experience, form the basis of political morality, that all men are created equal. I interpret that as a reference to the equality in a state of nature, that they are endowed with unalienable rights, which exist in metaphysical certitude, not the product of history and adjustment and accommodation and compromise. Second is the notion that governments are consciously and intentionally founded with a single discrete purpose, the protection of those personal rights. Oakeshott elsewhere calls this the fanciful doctrine of the Declaration of Independence. Third is the formalistic right to revolution, the idea that certain illegitimate government actions automatically trigger an immediate right to overthrow the government and institute a new one. So, a few observations on the Declaration's rationalist tendencies. First, it's important for reasons that will become clear later that all three of these aspects are generally Lockean in character, reflecting the notion that government is formed by the equal consent of individuals for the purpose of protecting personal rights, which they hold prior to and outside of civil life. Second, the abstract propositions as stated are remarkably vague. The Declaration does not attempt anything like a comprehensive model of political society. It does not attempt even to limn the outline of the certain rights that it references. It merely says that they are authoritative and moves on. Their content then must be filled in either from a shared political culture rooted in shared experience or from an ideology. Finally, the Declaration also tempers some of the rationalist implications of those passages in the text. The right to revolution, for instance, seems to follow logically from the violation of abstract rights, but weight is also given to real experience as a guide less certain than reason, but perhaps better. Right? Prudence indeed will dictate, and so on. Likewise, the list of grievances against the king are nearly all examples of historically recognized rights of Englishmen, and the majority of those examples in the litany of abuses relate distinctly to civic rights concerning representative self-government and civil institutions like juries, and these are precisely not the sort of rights that one can find in a state of nature, because they presuppose the existence of these institutions. The public's perception of the Declaration, of course, is much more rationalist than the text itself, having been transformed by subsequent political history from a document justifying a specific political disruption to one that purports to serve as a general statement of national purpose and as a guide to lawmaking. How, then, is a conservative, one who, with Oakeshott, or with Burke for that matter, questions the centrality of abstraction and universal principle as political guides, how is that person to think of the Declaration? The foregoing would suggest that a more fulsome embrace of the rationalist tendencies would have deleterious effects, insofar as it serves to frame our understanding of American politics. First, it would suggest that the more robust embrace of rationalism would, we should expect a sort of general lack of interest or even alienation from the granular experience and history of America. History will be seen only as valuable insofar as it serves as an illustration of a general principle, or will be seen as utterly tainted by the failure to conform to the principle. Second, we should expect the principles of the Declaration to steadily lose any shared meaning as Americans are alienated from their tradition and history, and they will instead become empty vessels filled from various conflicting sources that can be used for a time as political weapons until they lose all meaning entirely, in which case they won't even be useful for that. As Samuel Goldman has described them, they become glittering generalities that merely stand as proxies for political arguments in the present. Third, we should expect a style of politics to arise that is highly moralistic and even quasi-religious in character, promising to implement a pure form of social justice or national greatness unconstrained by circumstance, a style that tends to treat the pursuit of national goals as the march of providence. And when that style of politics repeatedly fails to fulfill its promise, we should expect a wave of dissolution and resentment. But assuming the conservative wants to temper the rationalist tendencies in politics, what is he to do with the Declaration's text itself? One possibility is to de-emphasize the Declaration as a symbol of the American tradition, or at least de-emphasize the second paragraph and emphasize instead the list of grievances and related things. By and large, this seems to have been Kendall and Carey's approach. They maintained that the Declaration was, quote, indeed a document that reaffirms the truths of our tradition, but to do that, they tended to downplay the second paragraph. All men are created equal, for them served to demonstrate only the equality of Americans with any other country, that Americans had the right to stand up and speak to Great Britain. And the gestures towards life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are largely ornamental. Oakeshott's account of rationalism, however, I think, opens up a side door for a somewhat different path for understanding the Declaration, even the Lockean elements, as part of the American tradition, without either elevating it to the status of the ultimate source of meaning or dismissing what it has to say. Oakeshott distinguished between two different forms of rationalist political writings. One of them he called the crib. And this, he said, is a conscious abridgment of a tradition, a rationalization purporting to elicit the truth of a tradition and to exhibit it in a set of abstract principles, but from which the full significance of the tradition inevitably escapes. So in other words, somebody who is consciously attempting to sort of distill the tradition in some way. The other form does not recognize its dependence on a tradition at all, but attempts to, quote, cover up all trace of the political habit and tradition of their society with a purely speculative idea. Interestingly, given his full criticism of the Declaration, it is precisely Locke that he identifies with the first, less wholly corrupting form of rationalism. He calls Locke's second treatise, though still a limited crib, he calls it valuable. 4 years after writing Rationalism in Politics, he strikes a more accommodating tone towards the crib. He says, now, every society which is intellectually alive is liable from time to time to abridge its traditions into a scheme of abstract ideas, and on occasion, political discussion will be concerned not with isolated transactions or with policies and traditions, but with general principles. And in this, there is no harm, perhaps even there is some positive benefit. It is possible that the distorting mirror of an ideology will reveal important hidden passages in the tradition, as a caricature reveals the potentialities of a face. But to make use of abridgment as a technique for exploring the intimations of a political tradition is one thing. It is something different and something inappropriate to understand political activity as the activity of amending the arrangements of society so as to make them all agree with the provisions of an ideology. So he seems to indicate that this form of a crib can have a valuable purpose in allowing people to explore and understand a certain aspect of a political tradition, so long as it is not made the sort of the Urim and Thummim of the tradition. I made that up on the spot. I think that's the right pronunciation. At some points, he even loses the dismissive tone when discussing Locke himself. And in reviewing a book on Locke's political theory, he observed that the value of Locke's work is that it states in abstract terms what were generally recognized to be the realities of English constitutional practice. And he generally approved of the book. When it comes to this sort of serious crib, Oakeshott seems to take it seriously but not literally. He maintains a healthy skepticism about the exalted claims made for any political system or set of principles, but he also takes it seriously, knowing that it did not come out of nowhere, and that it can perhaps illuminate certain aspects of a tradition if it is properly contextualized and put into conversation with other aspects of the tradition. The usefulness of these caricatures might be, and I am somewhat speculating here because he's definitely not clear on this, but it might be of even greater relevance in times of considerable cultural disruption. It's precisely these times when the rationalist approach seems so attractive, offering a vision of order in the face of seeming chaos. But Oakeshott cautioned that even in those times of crisis, the approach will work no better. He says this, if in order to meet these times of crisis, there were some steady, unchanging, independent guide to which a society might resort, it would no doubt be well advised to do so, but no such guide exists. We have no resources outside the fragments, the vestiges, the relics of its own tradition of behavior, which the crisis has left untouched. In times of upheaval, then, we may only be able to piece together the various shards of a tradition the best that we can, so as to give us a tolerable framework which time and experience may build around and form up into something more whole. That means it would be foolish to discard any artifact that may help in the recovery, but it also makes it more essential to recover those relics with the care and detail that historical excavation requires. This seems to me to be a viable approach that the anti-rationalist conservative might take to the Declaration of Independence as well. It is not the detailed crib of Locke's second treatise, but it is a symbol in the Anglo-American tradition. And I would add that Thomas Jefferson's famous letter to Henry Lee, I think, puts a lot of meat on those bones. If you know this letter to Henry Lee, he says that the Declaration is an attempt to synthesize the American. I botch quotes all the time. An attempt to essentially convey the general sentiments of the American mind. So there was a sense there, even though Jefferson undoubtedly had several rationalist tendencies. Even Jefferson was very aware that he was drawing on a long tradition of thought. And so I think that gives us a sort of entryway to think of the Declaration in that way, as a symbol of a tradition. So I end then with a handful of theses for the 250th anniversary from this perspective on the Declaration for non-rationalists. The first thesis is that the Declaration's meaning can't be understood separately from the culture and experience which produced it. So this relies heavily. You have to rely to interpret it heavily on the specific grievances, the specific questions that gave rise to it, the specific complaints that it made, the history of early resistance to in the early periods of the Revolution and even prior to when violence broke out, the experience of colonial self-government and the cultural inheritance and religious sentiment of its time. As Wilfred McClay has written, the Declaration was not a seminar paper. This was a work of political rhetoric composed at a time of immense urgency and addressing itself to fires of controversy, drawing upon the multiple streams of thought and sentiment that made up the American mind. Thesis number 2, it cannot be understood as containing any ultimate and exclusive definition of the country, its laws, or constitution. This would mean that this brand of conservative has to shelve the phrase, putting the principles of the Declaration into practice. The connections and similarities that can be drawn between the Declaration, Constitution, state constitutions, and so forth they're far better conceptualized as drawing from the same cultural font and drawing from those same streams, drawing from the same tradition. So they are similar, but it is not that the Declaration is the font itself. It too is coming out of a complex tradition. And that would mean that one cannot see the Declaration as having a legal or constitutional status, and we can't read further developments of the American tradition back into the Declaration. Third is that the Declaration can't be understood as a guide that gives us the answer to any given political problem if we meditate long enough on its principles. We will see similar looking ideas throughout the tradition, and we will be able to approach problems potentially from a similar standpoint with similar ideas, but we don't start from above, we start from within the tradition. And so we start from our own experience and our own cultural resources. Fourth, the Declaration cannot be appealed to for political unity that does not already emanate from the shared way of life. I think this is a very relevant one for the 250th anniversary, and that I think a lot of conservatives hope that appeals to the Declaration of Independence will produce a sort of civic unity that is so lacking. But the attempt to generate unity around ideals is a tantalizing but always fruitless endeavor if it is not there already from emerging from traditional practices. The hopeful claim that Americans, despite their differences, can unite around the principles of the Declaration tends to fall apart when we realize that those principles, because they are removed from that stream of tradition, are perpetually reinterpreted in a potential infinite number of ways by people who have an interest to do so. Fifth, the Declaration can and should be understood as the symbol of an explanation of a great action and an explanation of an action, the action of independence, that we should not sever the Declaration from what it was doing, right, and try to see the principles as up here and the action of what it was doing as somehow secondary or of less importance. So no denigration of history. And here I must bring up, right, Lincoln. Lincoln has a comment that the Declaration was not to be a merely revolutionary document. And there's a lot to unpack in that. But I think, of course, merely revolutionary has a degree of irony in it already. Right? Revolutionary is a big thing. But there is a sense that in that line and its context that the revolution itself was a sort of passing thing, and that the history and the action and the experience is a sort of passing thing, and it is the principles that are above and beyond that. But this approach, and certainly Oakeshott's approach, highly values experience, highly values the actual history itself. So that point number 5, then, that it should be seen as an explanation for an action, a particular historical action, and that is not a downgrade of it, that it is standing for, right, an essential part of the American experience. 6, then, its Lockean elements, the creed, can be understood as a symbol of certain intimations implicit in the Anglo-American tradition that were and are ripe for exploration. So this is where I differ a little bit from the Kendall and Carey approach and a lot of other 20th century conservatives who have used Oakeshott's approach in looking at the Declaration, in that rather than dismiss the second paragraph, one can approach it in the similar way that Oakeshott approaches Locke. That is, these are intimations that were coming into being in the early American experience that did indeed need to be wrestled with. There were new tensions that were emerging, tensions related to equality, tensions related to the understanding of personal liberty and so forth. And that the fact that the Declaration would use that language to justify the revolution is, as Oakeshott mentions when he's talking about these cribs, it is a symbol. There is something there. And that needs to be wrestled with and considered. And then finally, the alternative to the creedal nationalism built around this vision of the Declaration need not be, and I would say shouldn't be, another form of rationalism. So it's important that the essence of rationalism is not so much the abstraction. It's not that it's dealing with abstract ideas, although it's part of it, but the central part is that it's setting up a detached principle as the ultimate purpose and aim of political activity. Accordingly, some critiques of creedal nationalism are merely setting up some other principle that has been pulled out of the tradition and now set as the ultimate guiding proposition. So to do that, then, is to just set up one rationalization of the tradition against another. And Oakeshott's very direct on this, too. He says the notion of founding a society upon the Declaration of the Rights of Man is a creature of the rationalist brain, but so also are national or racial self-determination when elevated into universal principles. And that's the key phrase of that. And then he goes on to list like 20, a kind of comical list of like 25 examples of all these other things that have been powerful streams in the 19th and 20th century that are often elevated to that status of universal principle. The final line that in Rationalism and Politics points to the reality that most of the opposition to this or that ideological vision tends merely to create another one. Right? He says we have the spectacle of a set of sanctimonious rationalist politicians preaching an ideology of unselfishness and social service to a population in which they and their predecessors have done their best to destroy the only living root of moral behavior. And they are opposed then by another set of politicians dabbling with the project of converting us from rationalism under the inspiration of a fresh rationalization of our political tradition. That's the final line of that essay. So that's the final note he leaves, is that it is not typically one. The problem is not typically one rationalist ideology. It is the fact that it infuses everything we do. So this general approach to understanding the Declaration we might sum up with a familiar metaphor that will upset people. The American political experience in all its fullness, in its laws, its constitutions, its manners, its culture, its practices, its morals, memories, exemplars, its education, its historical consciousness, all of that, it cannot be fitly spoken in a document or a book, but that is always and necessarily the apple of gold. The Declaration and other symbols of parts of that experience serve to adorn and preserve it like a frame of silver. But the picture was made for the apple, or, from Oakeshott, the picture was made from the apple, not the apple from the picture. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Adam Tate. I'm a professor of history at Clayton State University in the Atlanta metro area. So my paper is going to be on looking at the Declaration, Union, and Confederation. So it's not going to be necessarily a theoretical paper, but more of a historical paper. All right. The 250th anniversary of the Declaration and the debates over American Union that followed offer an opportunity to revisit the context of 1776 Historians have often struggled to explain the connection between the Declaration and the first legal union of states, the Articles of Confederation. Most modern accounts have accepted an interpretation consonant with 19th century American nationalism. Both documents, they say, reflect the supremacy of a rights-based, centralized democratic order rather than a decentralized confederation. The problem of sources, however, complicates this interpretation and has made definite evidence hard to claim. There are no Madison's notes or a documentary history of ratification for the Articles of Confederation. In addition, writers have taken wildly different interpretations of the Declaration. Scholars generally have followed three broad approaches to connecting the documents, focusing on ideological battles, pragmatic political jockeying, or close textual analysis. Despite the different methods, historians lean heavily on ideological interpretations that privilege the nationalist school. An exploration of the letters of the delegates to the Continental Congress in 1775 and 1776 recaptures their mindsets and immediate concerns, thus shedding light on how they understood independence and confederation. The delegates were, after all, the main actors in shaping statements of independence and a new political arrangement. In fact, examining their letters reveals an underappreciated aspect of the delegates' interests, their understanding of the 18th century state system. That context suggests the United States to have been created as a confederation of sovereign states, reflecting a political system of cooperation and consent rather than one of domination and coercion. In short, in both the Declaration and Articles of Confederation, Americans sought a remedy for the problems of empire. During the late 17th and 18th centuries, many European thinkers understood, or wished, their continent to be a state system. The idea, articulated by the law of nations theorists such as Vattel, was that Europe was a community of equal nations, each possessing sovereignty and subject to the law of nature accessible through reason. For many 18th century European intellectuals, the vision of Europe as a community of equal nations under a rational law was an axiomatic principle. All thinking about geopolitics and international relations flowed from that vision. It became the basis for enlightened politics. But axioms are bedrock principles and are not necessarily proven by experience. Instead of equal nations under a rational law, Western Europe was a realm of three great empires competing for global dominance. Spain, France, and Great Britain contended for power throughout the 18th century, building large fleets, standing armies, and merchant classes. They were not small nations content with a political and economic world within their European borders, but possessed empires. For the small countries of Europe, there seemed to be only two practical solutions in the face of overwhelming force. Either a country could become a client state of an empire, or it could confederate. That is, it could create an alliance with other vulnerable neighbors for defense. By the second half of the 18th century, many European statesmen considered this balance of power among countries as the best way to preserve national power and independence. This debate over empire and confederation influenced the debates over American independence. In 1776, Americans separated from the British Empire and self-consciously built a country. It stands to reason, then, that they would frame their efforts in familiar ways to make their actions intelligible to Europeans. As the Declaration of Independence put it, let facts be submitted to a candid world. By 1775, Americans portrayed the British Empire as a system of domination and oppression based on force. Its claims of bringing peace and prosperity were seen as platitudes that obscured the oppression of people in its orbit. In a 1775 letter to Gouverneur Morris, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia referred to the British policies as their cruel system that aimed to reduce millions yet unborn to the abyss of slavery. Several weeks later, Congress concurred in its July 6, 1775 declaration setting forth the causes and necessities of taking up arms, written by John Dickinson. and some contributions from Jefferson. The delegates protested that their complaints from the previous 10 years had been ignored by the British government. Instead of a moderate political response, Parliament adopted an insidious maneuver calculated to divide us, to establish perpetual auctions of taxation where colony should bid against colony. It was the old trick of divide and conquer. Congress complained, "We are reduced to the alternative of choosing an unconditional submission to tyranny of irritated ministers or resistance by force." In choosing resistance, Congress explained, "We fight not for glory or for conquest." In other words, the colonists rejected the motivations of the British imperialists. A disgusted Benjamin Franklin in late July 1776 defined the British imperial system in the following manner: "Her fondness for conquest as a warlike nation, her lust of dominion as an ambitious one, and her thirst for a gainful monopoly as a commercial one, none of them legitimate causes of war, will all join to hide from her eyes every view of her true interests, and continually goad her on in these ruinous distant expeditions, so destructive of both of lives and treasure, that must prove as pernicious to her in the end as the Crusades formerly were to most of the nations of Europe." Conquest, dominion, monopoly. These were the tools of empire. Instead of guarding liberty, Britain had replicated the alleged evils of the medieval Crusades. Americans then fought not simply one bad ruler, but against an entire corrupt system. The corruption necessitated separation and the creation of an alternative political organization. Between 1775 and 1777, congressmen argued for Union and Confederation as the alternative to empire. In fact, what is stunning about congressional correspondence is the overwhelming consensus that Confederation was the specific union the colonies should seek. In July 1775, Benjamin Franklin presented to Congress a plan for Confederation. Given the dialogue about the oppressive system of the British Empire, Franklin's Confederation rested on a strikingly different foundation. In Article 2, Franklin describes the Confederation as a firm league of friendship. Article 3 continues by affirming that each colony shall enjoy and retain as much as it may think fit of its own present laws, customs, rights, privileges, and peculiar jurisdictions within its own limit. In other words, consent and cooperation were the animating principles of Confederation. This was a far cry from coercion and domination, the spirit of empire. Franklin considered the purpose of Confederation to be the common defense of the colonies and security of their liberties, properties, the safety of their persons and families, and their mutual and general welfare. This system, he thought, could offer the security needed. During the spring of 1776, as delegates moved toward declaring independence, calls for Confederation became more urgent. Congressmen, believing that a declaration of independence coupled with a strong Confederation would allow them to establish diplomatic relations with European nations, particularly France, who could provide access to markets and even military assistance against Britain. On May 11, 1776, New Hampshire delegate William Whipple remarked, "A confederation permanent and lasting ought, in my opinion, to be the next thing, and I hope it's not far off." Similarly, John Adams, who had been stressing for a couple of months the need for confederation, told his wife Abigail on May 17th, "Confederation will be necessary for our internal concord." Congress, however, declared independence previous to agreeing on a confederation. Negotiations on the specific form the confederation would take would follow. This would be more difficult than anticipated. Now, despite the almost unanimous calls for confederation, there were individuals who desired a different order. If the colonies declared independence, there would be an opportunity to organize the new nation in a way Congress and the colonies saw fit. John Adams' letter to Patrick Henry on June 3rd, 1776, conveyed this possibility. Here's what he says. He says, "It has ever appeared to me that the natural course and order of things was this: for every colony to institute a government, for all the colonies to confederate, and define the limits of the Continental Constitution. Then declare the colonies a sovereign state, or a number of confederated sovereign states, and last of all, to form treaties with foreign powers. In other words, would the new country be a confederation or one sovereign state? Well, there's the question. Adams raises it in June. Adams had already indicated in his Thoughts on Government, written to combat Thomas Paine's arguments for a singular national republic in common sense, that he favored a confederation rather than a centralized government. But here he admitted that another option existed. In Congress, a small group of nationalists wished to create one national sovereign, in which the colonies and then states would be administrative units of the central authority. Generally, these congressmen believed that such an arrangement would be more rational and reduce the chances of internal fighting that could destroy the whole. Two Pennsylvania congressional delegates, Benjamin Rush and James Wilson, made the nationalist case consistently. Benjamin Rush, a physician, and James Wilson, a Scottish immigrant who read law with John Dickinson, argued for a unitary national government. During the first congressional debates over the Articles, Rush noted that the objects before us are the people's rights, not the rights of states. He protested colony distinctions, asserting we are now one people, a new nation, our interests, language, and trade not more divided than they are among the people in Britain. In addition, Rush maintained that the states in their separate capacity were dependent, not independent sovereigns. While the states did protect the rights of citizens, the vulnerability of the states made them dependent on Congress. According to Jefferson's notes on the congressional debates of July 1776, James Wilson argued, "It has been said that Congress is a representation of states, not of individuals. I say that the objects of its care are all the individuals of the states." Agreeing with Rush, he continued, "As to those matters which are referred to Congress, we are not so many states, we are one large state. We lay aside our individuality whenever we come here." Thus, Wilson preferred a centralized power in Congress, which would then be able to protect individual rights. Voting by states, he worried, would sacrifice the interest of the whole to that of the small states. A centralized nation, therefore, was preferable to a decentralized confederation. Rush and Wilson, however, were the exception, not the rule, at least in the letters. The letters of the congressional delegates did not show enthusiasm for creating an American empire. Instead, the majority of congressmen interpreted the free and independent states of the Declaration of Independence as establishing a new country composed of sovereign and independent states that presented a common face to other nations while retaining their own powers of self-government. The United States, they thought, had joined the community of nations and deserved equal status. Confederation was not designed to assault state sovereignty, but to protect it from both internal and external threats. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina expressed his hostility to the nationalists most memorably in a June 29, 1776 letter. He says, "The idea of destroying all provincial distinctions and making everything of the most minute kind bend to what they call the good of the whole is, in other terms, to say that these colonies must be subject to the government of the eastern provinces," that is New England. State equality, then, was necessary to prevent larger states, or cohesive regions, from dominating smaller ones. As for entrusting great authority in the center, Rutledge explained, "I am resolved to vest the Congress with no more power than what is absolutely necessary, and to use a familiar expression, to keep the staff in our own hands. For I am confident if surrendered into the hands of others, a most pernicious use will be made of it." The common understanding of Confederation manifested in September 1776 at a peace conference between Lord Richard Howe and 3 congressional delegates. Howe had arrived in New York with a large military force after Congress declared independence, and by August had taken Long Island. In early September, Howe told Congress that he had a peace commission and sought to end the conflict honorably. On September 6, Congress agreed to send Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge to meet with Howe. The issue, however, was that Howe would not recognize them as representatives of an independent United States. In other words, Britain refused to accept the equality of the new country, thus signaling that they did not see the United States as part of the state system. To Lord Howe, returning to the empire was their future. At the discussions in New York, John Adams told Howe that the resolution of Congress to declare the independency was not taken up upon their own authority. They had been instructed to do so by all the colonies, and that it was not in their power to treat otherwise than as independent states. In other words, authority came from the people in each state. Adams had no authority other than that granted through the independent states. Franklin concurred, telling Howe that it would take as much time for the American representatives to refer to and get their answer from their constituents as it would the British commissioners to get fresh instructions from home, which he supposed might be done in about 3 months. Franklin thus admitted that he, as a congressman, had no independent authority to negotiate. All authority came from the independent states. On September 17th, Congress summed up the committee members' sentiments, holding that it was bound by the voice of their constituents. Congress had no power to enter into conference or receive any propositions on the subject of peace which do not, as a preliminary, acknowledge these states to be sovereign and independent. Congress represented the states in foreign affairs to protect their independence and sovereignty, not to override it. Congress here claimed no independent authority. This was not the nationalist vision. Far from being simply a justification for self-interest in small-minded, jealous states, as it is often portrayed, the theory of Confederation articulated by its American advocates in 1776 contained positive goals linked to opposition to empire. Most commonly, congressmen promoted Confederation to unite and protect diverse communities without demanding cultural uniformity. As the way of empire, as Franklin had reminded Lord Howe, was domination, and that had alienated the former attachment Americans felt toward Britain. Empires relied on force. In 1774, Americans began invoking the Swiss Confederation as a model of union. South Carolina merchant Ralph Izard, for example, visited Geneva in 1774, noting, "I am much pleased with this little republic, and am astonished at its having preserved itself amid the almost general wreck of the liberties of Europe." In a following letter to Henry Laurens, the future president of Congress, he added, "I am delighted at seeing so many seats of freedom surrounded by so many powerful tyrants." He told Laurens that he wished all the Swiss would become Protestants to minimize a potential source of conflict, but admitted that the Confederation was peaceful. Furthermore, in October 1774, Congress sent an appeal to the inhabitants of Quebec to seek support from the Canadians against the British. Congress proposed a union based on the Swiss model. The Confederation of the Swiss was composed of Roman Catholic and Protestant states living in the utmost concord and peace with one another, and thereby enabled them to defy and defeat every tyrant that has invaded them. In July 1776, during the first debates over the Articles, John Witherspoon of New Jersey celebrated the Swiss model as well. Not only were the cantons varied in wealth and strength, but also in religion. Yet, he noted, these confederates are seldom engaged in war with other nations. Confederacies, insisted Witherspoon, sought peace as their union quieted potential divisions among them. Congress expressed an identical message in November 1777 after approving the draft of the Articles of Confederation. In the letter to the states urging quick ratification of the document, which of course didn't come, Congress wrote, "To form a permanent union accommodated to the opinions and wishes of the delegates of so many states, differing in habits, produce, commerce, and internal police, was found to be a work which nothing but time and reflection, conspiring with a disposition to conciliate, could mature and accomplish." The internal diversity, however, had not undermined the project. The delegates had compromised and agreed to the articles proposed. Let them be candidly reviewed, Congress advised, under a sense of the difficulty of combining in one general system the various sentiments and interests of a continent divided into so many sovereign and independent communities. Under a conviction of the absolute necessity of uniting all our counsels and all our strength to maintain and defend our common liberties. The language sounded remarkably like the descriptions of the Swiss Confederation. Diverse, sovereign, and independent communities with different habits and customs, came together freely to defend themselves and protect their liberties. The United States then, according to Congress, has joined the community of nations on enlightened but not imperial terms. With congressional approval of the Articles of Confederation, it was clear that the minority of congressional nationalists had lost. A different vision prevailed. Americans hoped that a confederated union that protected the sovereignty and independence of the states would secure liberty both from domestic and foreign threats. Their vision coincided with the enlightened views of international law and order common in the 18th century. Empire, they believed, had threatened liberty, peace, and prosperity. It was the Articles of Confederation, they hoped, that could secure these goods to America without abandoning the strength needed to navigate the treacherous world of the 18th century state system. Failure to do so, however, meant that the nationalists, who had lost in 1776 and 77, would return with their solutions. That's my paper. Thank you.
You have been listening to The Sower, a production of the Ciceronian Society. To learn more about us, our programs, and to sign up for our newsletter, please visit ciceroniansociety.org.